There is a scene in Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York that most people miss, not because it's hidden, because it's quiet. Jenny Everdeen, played by Cameron Diaz, is undressing. Amsterdam Valen sees the scars on her body. She doesn't explain them. She doesn't have to. The camera lingers just long enough for you to understand that whatever happened to this woman happened a long time ago, and it happened in a place where nobody was coming to help. That silence, that refusal to explain, that is the most honest thing in the entire film. Because what it tells you about the real 5 points, about the real women and children who survived there, is darker than anything Scorsese could have put on screen. And the man standing at the center of that world, the man who owned it, shaped it, and decided who lived or died inside it, Bill the Butcher. He wasn't just a gang leader, he was the law. He was the economy. He was the reason people like Jenny became who they were, not by accident, by design. This is the story of power in its most absolute form. Not the power of governments or armies, but the power of one man over a neighborhood so broken, so forgotten, that it became a world unto itself. This is the story of 5 Points, the most dangerous slum in American history. The place where children grew up before they ever got the chance to be young. The place where a woman's survival was never free. And the place where a butcher from New Jersey built an empire on blood, nativism, and fear that shaped the lives of everyone trapped beneath him. But here's what most people don't know. The real 5 Points was worse than anything in the movie. Far worse. And the stories the film only hints at, the ones buried in silence and implication, those were the everyday reality for thousands of women and girls who had no name, no advocate, and no way out. Jenny Everdeen is fiction. But the world that made her was terrifyingly real. You have to understand where this all began. Not with gangs, not with knives, with water. In the late 1700s, Lower Manhattan had a body of fresh water called the Collect Pond. It sat roughly where the courthouses stand today, south of Canal Street. For decades, tanneries and slaughterhouses dumped waste into it. By 1800, the pond was so polluted that the city decided to fill it in. The project was completed around 1811 to 1812. They covered the entire thing with dirt and rock, then laid out new streets on top. Anthony Street, Cross Street, Orange Street. These 3 roads converged at an irregular intersection that created 5 corners, 5 points. That was the name. And from the moment those streets were drawn, the ground beneath them was rotting. The landfill settled unevenly. Foundations cracked. Basements flooded. The earth itself seemed to reject what had been built on top of it. Within a decade, respectable residents fled. What filled the vacuum was poverty on a scale that most Americans had never seen. By the 1830s, 5 Points was the most densely packed slum in the Western Hemisphere. The streets were unpaved. A foot of mud mixed with human and animal waste covered the ground at all times. There was no sanitation, no clean water. The buildings leaned into each other like drunks holding each other up. And at the center of it all stood one building that became the symbol of everything 5 Points represented, the old brewery. It was built in 1792 by a man named Isaac Coulthard. Originally, it was just that, a brewery, a legitimate business on what was then the outskirts of town. But after the financial panic of 1837 wiped out businesses across the city, the brewery shut down. Someone converted it into a tenement. What happened next defies belief. Over 1,000 men, women, and children packed themselves into that single building. Around its perimeter ran an alley 3 feet wide that locals called Murderer's Alley, and that name was not poetry. It was reporting. Inside was a room known as the Den of Thieves, where 75 people lived without furniture, without ventilation, without light. Women conducted prostitution in the same rooms where children slept on the floor. Herbert Asbury, who wrote the definitive account of this world in his 1928 book, The Gangs of New York, reported that when demolition crews finally tore the old brewery down in December of 1852, they found human bones in the cellar walls. According to a persistent urban legend, the old brewery averaged a murder a night for 15 years. Even if that number is exaggerated, the reality was horrifying enough that when the famous author Charles Dickens visited Five Points in 1842, accompanied by 2 police officers for protection, he wrote afterward that it was a place of such wretchedness that the very houses seemed prematurely old. He described narrow ways reeking with dirt and filth, rooms lit by a single dim candle, and an atmosphere where all that is loathsome, drooping, and decayed was concentrated in one spot. This wasn't London. This was New York City, the richest port in the Americas. And less than a mile from Wall Street, people were living in conditions that made the worst slums of Europe look comfortable. Now here's where the story shifts from geography to power. Because a place like Five Points didn't just happen. It was governed. Not by the city, not by the police. The police barely came here. The 6th Ward, which encompassed 5 Points, was known as the most lawless jurisdiction in Manhattan. What governed 5 Points was the gang structure. And the gangs didn't just fight each other for territory. They controlled everything: employment, housing, protection, food, access. If you lived in 5 Points and you weren't connected to a gang, you were prey. And the man who best understood this, the man who turned that understanding into absolute dominion, was William Poole, Bill the Butcher. He was born on July 24th, 1821, in Sussex County, New Jersey. Not 5 Points, not even New York. His family moved to Manhattan in 1832 and opened a butcher shop in Washington Market. Poole learned his father's trade and eventually took over the family store. By all accounts, he was a large man for the era, 6 feet tall, over 200 pounds. And he was known for a fighting style that had no rules: biting off noses, gouging out eyeballs, beating men, as one account put it, to jelly. He wasn't refined. He wasn't strategic the way later mob bosses would be, but he understood something fundamental about 5 Points. Power wasn't about money. It was about fear, and nobody generated fear like Bill Poole. He became the leader of the Washington Street Gang, which later evolved into the Bowery Boys. And the Bowery Boys weren't just a street gang. They were a political force. Poole aligned himself with the Know Nothing Party, a nativist, militantly anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant political movement that wanted to stop the flood of Irish immigrants pouring into New York. The Whig Party nominated Poole as a candidate for alderman of the 6th Ward in 1848. By 1853, he had been appointed to the New York City Board of Education. Think about that. A bare-knuckle brawler who gouged out eyes was sitting on the Board of Education. That's 5 Points. That's how power worked. And his power extended into every corner of the neighborhood. Poole and the Bowery Boys terrorized Irish Catholic immigrants. They attacked them in the streets. They prevented them from voting. And in response, the Irish created their own gangs: the Dead Rabbits, the Roach Guards, the Carryonians. For years, the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits waged open warfare across lower Manhattan. A week seldom passed without a clash along the Bowery or inside the 5 Points. This wasn't organized crime in the modern sense. This was territorial warfare, where the battlefield was the same streets, where children played and women hung laundry. You want to understand, Jenny Everdeen. You have to understand what this world did to women, and especially to girls. In the mid-1850s, there were over 30,000 homeless, unsupervised children living on the streets of New York City. 30,000. Many of them in or around 5 Points. These weren't runaways from middle-class families. These were children born into tenements where parents drank themselves to death or simply vanished. A contemporary account from the Ladies' Home Missionary Society described the scene in language that still cuts through the centuries. The children, it said, hundreds of them, with drunken fathers and drunken mothers, who made no provision for their comfort, and scarce any for their physical existence. They crept to sleep, greeted with oaths and curses, and ofttimes with stripes and heavy blows. Children precocious in self-reliance, in deceit, in every evil passion. And then this line, about girls specifically. Girlhood is there, not ingenuous, blushing, confiding youth, but reckless, hardened, shameless effrontery. That wasn't a novelist writing fiction. That was a missionary describing what she saw with her own eyes. Here's where it gets darker. In a world where legitimate work for women paid pennies, where factory jobs meant 14-hour days for wages that couldn't cover rent, the options were brutally limited. Some women turned to pickpocketing, some to shoplifting, some to confidence scams where they lured men into alleys to be robbed by accomplices. And some, particularly the youngest and most vulnerable, fell into the orbit of men who offered protection in exchange for dependency. This wasn't romance. This was economics. In 5 Points, a girl without protection was a girl who wouldn't survive, and the men who offered that protection demanded payment of every kind. A woman named Fredrika Mandelbaum, known on the streets as Marm Mandelbaum, became the most powerful female criminal in New York during this era. She ran a dry goods store on Clinton and Rivington Streets as a front. Behind it, she operated as the city's most successful fence for over 30 years, roughly 1860 to 1890. But here's the part that connects directly to Jenny Everdene's story. Marm Mandelbaum ran a school for pickpockets. She took in destitute children from the streets and taught them to steal rather than starve. She financed heists, posted bail for her associates, and built a criminal empire that employed hundreds. The press called her the Queen of Thieves, and she was regarded as a maternal patron to hundreds of young pickpockets, shoplifters, and confidence artists, many of them girls, many of them children. You see where Jenny fits now. Not as a character in a movie, as an archetype. The girl who was taken in young. The girl who was trained by someone with power. The girl whose survival skills were purchased at a cost that the film only suggests through scars and silences. In Scorsese's telling, Jenny is Bill, the butcher's former lover. She moves through 5 Points with the confidence of someone who knows the streets and the wariness of someone who knows what the streets cost. When Amsterdam discovers her scars, the film doesn't explain them, because 5 Points didn't explain things. It just left marks. And Bill the butcher, you have to understand what a man like him meant in a world like this. He wasn't just a fighter. He wasn't just a gang leader. He was the entire infrastructure. In 5 Points, there was no functioning government. There was no reliable police force. There was no court system that the poor could access. What there was Bill. And Bill decided who worked, who ate, who was protected, and who was available. That's the word the film avoids. Available. Because when one man controls everything in a neighborhood where survival depends on access to resources, the people who have the least power, women and children, become the currency of that system. Not always through direct violence, sometimes through the simple, grinding pressure of having no other options. The real William Poole died on March 8, 1855. He was 33 years old. His rival, John Morrissey, a Tammany Hall-aligned Irish gangster, had plotted revenge after a series of violent confrontations between the two. On February 25, 1855, recently fired NYPD patrolman Louis Baker and an associate named Jim Turner, allegedly acting as enforcers for Morrissey, shot Poole in the leg and chest at Stanwix Hall. Poole lingered for 11 days. According to the legend that grew up around his death, his last words were, "Goodbye, boys. I die a true American." Whether he actually said that is disputed, but the fact that the legend persisted tells you everything about how he was seen, not as a thug, as a patriot, a nativist martyr. His funeral procession drew thousands through the streets of Manhattan. But Poole's death didn't end what he built. The system of gang-controlled neighborhoods, the fusion of street violence and political power, the exploitation of the most vulnerable, all of that continued. On July 4th, 1857, 2 years after Poole's death, the Dead Rabbits erupted out of 5 Points and attacked the Bowery Boys in what became known as the Dead Rabbits Riot. The fighting lasted 2 days. Armed men battled with clubs, knives, paving stones, and guns across the intersections that Poole had once controlled. The police were overwhelmed. The state militia had to be called in. 8 people were killed. Over 100 were injured. And the newspapers reported it with the kind of breathless horror usually reserved for foreign wars. You know what's remarkable about Scorsese's film? It's not what he showed. It's what he chose not to. The draft riots of 1863, which form the climax of Gangs of New York, killed at least 120 people. Many of the victims were black residents of Manhattan, targeted by Irish mobs furious over the Civil War conscription law that allowed wealthy men to buy their way out of service for $300, while the poor had to fight. That violence, racially motivated, class-driven, state-sanctioned in its negligence, was the direct descendant of what Bill the Butcher built, a world where power flowed downhill and crushed whoever was at the bottom. But the film's most important choice was Jenny, by making her a pickpocket with scars she won't explain, by placing her in Bill's orbit as someone who once belonged to him, by showing her intelligence and toughness alongside the evidence of what she endured. Scorsese did something that most historical accounts of 5 Points never do. He put a face on the unnamed. The girls who appear in Missionary reports as statistics. The children described as precocious in every evil passion. The women who survived through what the historical record delicately calls protection arrangements. Jenny isn't just a character. She's a memorial to every girl who walked through 5 Points and was never counted. Consider what we know about the real world she represents. In the 1840s and 50s, girls in 5 Points entered the streets as young as 5 or 6. Some swept crossings for pennies. Some begged. Some were recruited by criminal networks that functioned like apprenticeship programs. Marm Mandelbaum's pickpocket school wasn't unique. It was simply the most famous. Throughout 5 Points, older criminals took in younger ones. The transaction was always the same. I'll keep you alive, you'll do what I say. For boys, that meant theft, running messages, acting as lookouts. For girls, the arrangement often carried additional dimensions that no one wrote down because no one thought they needed to. The silence in the historical record is the same silence in the film, and that silence is the loudest thing about it. Charles Loring Brace, a social reformer who worked in 5 Points during this period, eventually organized what became known as the orphan train movement. Starting in the 1850s, Brace arranged for poor and homeless children to be transported from New York City to farm families in the Midwest. The idea was to remove them from the squalor of 5 Points and give them a chance at a better life. Some of those children were indeed saved. But the accounts vary on how many simply traded one form of exploitation for another. Some farming families treated the children as cheap labor. Some experienced abuse in their new homes. The system that produced them was so broken that even the rescue efforts carried their own shadows. The Ladies' Home Missionary Society purchased the old brewery in 1852, tore it down in December of that year, and built the new mission house on the site. They made children their first concern. And for the first time, some of the youngest residents of 5 Points had access to schooling, clean clothes, and meals that didn't come with conditions. But the mission could only reach so many. 5 Points stretched across blocks. Thousands of people lived in its tenements. And the gang structure that controlled the neighborhood didn't disappear because a church group moved in. Nearly 20 years after Dickens, Abraham Lincoln himself visited 5 Points during a trip to New York while considering a run for the presidency. He spent time at a Sunday school run by the reformers. The fact that a future president felt he needed to witness 5 Points firsthand tells you about its reputation. It was the place that defined American poverty, the worst of us, the thing we were supposed to fix. And we didn't, not for decades, not until the streets were literally rearranged and renamed. Anthony Street became Worth Street, Orange Street became Baxter Street, Cross Street became Park Street. The city didn't reform 5 Points. It erased it. Today, the intersection where those 5 corners once met lies somewhere beneath the Manhattan Civic Center. Courthouses and government buildings stand where the old brewery once harbored 1,000 people in darkness. There's no plaque, no monument, no marker for the children who grew up there, or the women who survived it, or the men who died in its alleys. And that's the final truth about power in 5 Points. It wasn't just that Bill the Butcher controlled the streets. It's that the system he represented, the system of violence, dependency, exploitation, and silence, lasted long after he was buried. The gangs evolved. The Bowery Boys gave way to the 5 Points Gang, which was founded by an Italian-American named Paul Kelly, and that gang produced the next generation of American organized crime. Johnny Torrio came out of the 5 Points Gang. Al Capone came out of the 5 Points Gang. Lucky Luciano came out of the 5 Points Gang. The line runs straight from Bill the Butcher's territorial warfare in the 1840s to the Mafia families that would control New York for the next 100 years. 5 Points didn't just produce criminals. It produced a model, a template for how power operates when law is absent and poverty is constant. Control the resources, control the people, make survival conditional on loyalty, and make sure that the most vulnerable have nowhere else to go. Jenny Everdeen understood this. That's what her silence means. It means she knows that explaining her past won't change it. It means she knows that the scars aren't the story. The system that made them is the story. And that system didn't die with Bill the Butcher. It didn't die when the old brewery came down. It didn't die when the streets were renamed. In some form, in some neighborhood, in some forgotten corner of some city, it's still running. Scorsese understood this too. That's why he ended Gangs of New York not with a battle or a speech, but with a time lapse. The camera pulls back from the graves of the characters we've followed and shows Manhattan growing around them. Buildings rise. The skyline changes. The graves disappear under weeds, under progress, under the weight of a city that keeps building upward without ever looking down at what it buried. 5 Points is gone. The streets don't exist anymore. The old brewery is a memory of a memory. Bill the Butcher is a character most people know from a movie, not from history. And Jenny Everdeen, she's the girl who never existed and always existed, in every tenement, in every protection arrangement, in every silence that covered something too dark to name. That's the real story of 5 Points. Not gangs, not territory, not even violence. It's the story of what happens to people when power has no check and survival has no floor. It's the story of how an entire world can exist inside a single neighborhood, complete with its own economy, its own justice, its own casualties. And it's the story of how that world can vanish from the map, but never from the pattern of how things work. If you're still here, if you stayed through all of that, then you understand something most people never consider when they watch Gangs of New York. The movie isn't about the past. It's about the architecture of power itself. And that architecture hasn't changed. The addresses have. The names have, the accents have, but the structure, the way the strong shape the lives of the weak, the way silence covers what nobody wants to name, the way survival always comes at a cost that the survivors carry forever, that structure is the same. 5 Points is still here. It just moved. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe. We release a new documentary every week. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What part of 5 Points history do you want us to dig into next?